The nutrient broth was cold again. Subcommander Veth Aros, third son of the Southern House of Dur, a veteran of 14 imposition campaigns, and recipient of the Logistics Efficiency Medal for 2 consecutive cycles, contemplated the container with the resignation of someone who had already accepted that certain battles simply weren't worth the energy spent fighting them. The vending machine in Corridor C7 of the flagship Unwavering Purpose had been malfunctioning for 16 days. The maintenance form had been submitted. The request awaited approval at Level 4 of the Auxiliary Services hierarchy. Veth Aros drank the cold broth and returned to his workstation. Around him, the 5th Fleet Logistics Operations Center of the Sovereignty hummed with the discrete efficiency of a machine that had been perfectly calibrated over 3 centuries. 242 operators worked in unison, processing supply vectors, calculating translation windows, and coordinating the movement of a fleet that, if aligned end-to-end, would be long enough to traverse a medium-sized solar system. Veth Aros was responsible for ensuring that all gears of that machinery kept turning. It was a thankless job. It was, therefore, a job he did better than any other officer of his rank. The notification of compliance for the human cluster had been issued the previous afternoon at 14:33 by the Sovereignty's centralized time. Veth Aros had reviewed the document 4 times before digitally signing it, not out of doubt regarding its content, but out of professional habit. It was a boilerplate document, version 7. 4 of the standard form, used with minor variations in 847 previous impositions since the Sovereignty's founding. The name Humanity had been inserted into the appropriate fields by a junior assistant. The response deadline had been adjusted from 48 to 72 hours, a generous concession considering the reduced scale of the cluster. The human cluster comprised 12 inhabited systems, with a total population that analysts estimated at approximately 11 billion individuals. It was, in the words of Admiral Dreth Vaughn, who commanded the 5th Fleet, a formality with coordinates. Human defense capability had been carefully catalogued: 14 medium-class patrol ships, none with quantum field shields above Level 3, 6 orbital stations without relevant offensive weaponry, and an annual military budget equivalent to approximately 0.03% of the maintenance cost of a single Sovereignty flagship. Analytical models had processed this set of variables and produced an expected result with a margin of error of less than 2%, complete compliance within the stipulated time frame. Veth Aros had no reason to disagree with the models. He knew humanity from the standard intelligence brief, 12 pages compiled by cultural analysis departments about 9 years ago, when humans had signed the Preliminary Access Treaty and begun appearing in the Sovereignty's trade corridors. They were a young species, biologically fragile, with a life expectancy that made them, from a galactic perspective, little more than ambitious flies. Their home planet was a place of wild climatic conditions, moderate gravity, and a history punctuated by internal conflicts of unsettling frequency. The brief described them as adaptable and commercially aggressive. There was a footnote about their tolerance to chemical substances that would be lethal to most known species, specifically citing something called caffeine and a fermented grain-based beverage. Veth Aros had read the footnote and forgotten about it the next day. The human response arrived at 11:17 the next day, as recorded by the flagship's communication system, 46 hours after the notification was sent. The Cultural Analysis Department had predicted a response between 44 and 70 hours, so the timing fit within normal parameters. What did not fit was the content. Veth Aros read the message 3 times. To the Sovereignty, represented by the 5th Galactic Fleet, we acknowledge receipt of the notification of compliance dated cycle 44447, protocol reference SV7, 4 Human 001. We understand the terms in their entirety. We respectfully request that you withdraw them. We will not ask again. Sincerely, Office of Foreign Relations of the Unified Council of Humanity. He forwarded the message to the Cultural Analysis Department with a note requesting interpretation. The response came back in 40 minutes. Probability of bluff, 94, 7%. Probability of coordinated armed resistance, 1%. Probability of unspecified unconventional response, 2%. The recommendation was to proceed with the original plan. Vetharos reread the phrase, "We will not ask again," for the 5th time. There was something in the economy of that phrase that disturbed him in ways he couldn't name. In his 14 campaigns, species that bluffed usually did so with flourishes, with lists of armaments they didn't possess, with threats of alliances that never materialized. This message carried the silent weight of someone simply describing reality as it was. But models were models, and Vetharos was a man of models. He filed his perturbation under the same mental category where he kept the cold broth machine, the unprocessed maintenance forms, and the inevitable frictions of a career in logistics. Then he returned to work. Admiral Dreth Vaughn convened the briefing meeting at 15:00. The flagship's conference room was a space designed to impress, with translucent walls displaying the fleet's formation in real time, 3,000 ships distributed in a controlled advance pattern, each represented by a pale blue light point. They were beautiful points. Vetharos had always found them so, an artificial constellation of projected power. The admiral was a tall, angular being of the Veldur species, known for their longevity and an approach to strategy that bordered on artistic contempt. He presented the advance plan with the same inflection he would use to discuss the reorganization of a file. The Fifth Fleet would advance into the Delta 9 trade corridor, the main traffic artery between human systems and export routes to the rest of the galaxy. There, they would establish an inspection checkpoint. All commercial traffic would be subject to retroactive taxation of 34% over the last 3 cycles, according to the terms of the Notification of Compliance. The military presence would be sufficient to ensure cooperation. No shots would be necessary. There were 17 officers in the room. None raised objections. Vetharos raised no objections. He was thinking about the phrase, "We will not ask again," and how it didn't sound like a bluff. It sounded like a diagnosis, but models were models, and the meeting was over. The next morning, when the first human civilian ship was intercepted in the Delta 9 corridor and the inspection officer requested the cargo manifest, Vetharos was at his post monitoring fleet supply logs. It was only when the second status report arrived, 4 hours after the inspection began, that he noticed something unusual. The inspection was still ongoing. For a medium-sized civilian ship, the estimated time was 40 minutes. He pulled up the cargo manifest file to understand the delay and stared at the screen for a long moment. The document had 4,987 cataloged items. Vetharos took another sip of the cold broth and felt, for the first time in his career, that the temperature of the broth was the least of his problems. The cargo manifest for the human ship designated HC Provisional 7 had exactly 4,987 items. Vetharos knew this because he had counted, not manually, of course, but he had activated the file system's automatic line counter 3 times, as if expecting the number to change between one check and the next. The number had not changed. 4,987 items remained, 4,987 items, each with its own customs code subdivision, according to the Sovereignty's Commercial Inspection Protocol, version 12. 3 ratified 2 cycles ago after 8 years of negotiations with the Galactic Chamber of Commerce. The inspection officer, Sub-Lieutenant Karevos, had submitted a situation report that Vetharos read with increasing and uncomfortable attention. According to the report, the manifest was formally within all specifications of Protocol 12. 3. Each item used the correct codes. Each subcategory was properly referenced. The problem was structural. The document was not organized like a manifest. It was organized like an 18-generation family tree with branching subdivisions. Item number 1 was named Cargo. Its subcategories included primary cargo, secondary cargo, and tertiary cargo with variable risk classification. Each of these 3 subcategories further divided into 8 others, which in turn subdivided into 6 more, until at the 12th level of hierarchy, one found the listing for a single 4mm titanium screw, accompanied by its complete technical sheet, its certificate of origin, a declaration of molecular composition, and a footnote explaining why that specific screw was not subject to the ferrous metals tariff agreement of 3891, but rather to the non-ferrous industrial metals tariff agreement of 4102, with cross-references to 2 amendments and an interpretative addendum issued by a Chamber of Commerce subcommittee that had been dissolved 2 cycles ago. The footnote was correct. Veth Aros checked. Sub-Lieutenant Karevos had processed 73 items in 4 hours. At the current pace, completing the inspection of ship HC Provisional 7 would take approximately 22 days. This alone would be only a manageable problem. The problem that made Veth Aros unable to finish his cold broth was that, as he read Sub-Lieutenant Karevos's report, his secondary screen began displaying sector arrival alerts. First alert: Ship HC Provisional 12 entered the Delta 9 corridor. Second alert: Ship HC Provisional 19 entered the Delta 9 corridor. Third alert: Ship HC Provisional 23 entered the Delta 9 corridor. Within 40 minutes, there were 46 human civilian ships distributed throughout the Delta 9 corridor, each perfectly obeying checkpoint instructions, each presenting their documents when requested, each absolutely cooperative with the sovereignty's inspection process. Veth Aros calculated the situation with the mechanical precision of someone who had dedicated 3 decades to logistics problems. 46 ships, each with a manifest estimated to be of similar complexity to HC Provisional 7. 22 days per inspection, if processed sequentially and with all available staff. The number that emerged from this calculation was not a number. It was an abstract category of administrative impossibility. He submitted a report to Admiral Drethvon at 1742. The response arrived at 1805 in 2 segments. The first was an order to double the inspection teams. The second was a phrase that Veth Aros suspected had been written with the same glacial coldness with which the Admiral usually articulated his displeasure. "This is paper. Deal with it with paper." Veth Aros doubled the teams, then tripled them, then summoned all available customs and trade specialists in the fleet, 32 individuals of diverse species, all certified in version 12. 3 of the inspection protocol. He sent each one to a different ship. The next day, the reports came back. The manifest for ship HC Provisional 19 contained not 4 987 items, but 7 341, and it included a section titled Documentation of Certification Processes for Listed Items, which alone had more pages than the operating manual of a Lightning-class warship. The manifest for HC Provisional 34 came with a separate set of supplementary notes on regulatory context, totaling 892 pages, all impeccably drafted and filled with cross-references to trade agreements the sovereignty had signed over the past 2 centuries. The manifest for HC Provisional 41 was completely correct in its structure. The problem was that it was written in 6 different human languages, and Protocol 12. 3 did not specify which language was the official version in case of interpretive ambiguity between translations. Veth Aros consulted the Protocol 12. 3 manual. There was no answer to this question. There was a note stating that issues of linguistic ambiguity should be forwarded to the Chamber of Commerce's Subcommittee for Documentary Standardization for resolution. The standard response time for the subcommittee was 60 days. Then the humans brought the food. This was what most disconcerted Veth Aros. At some level, he had difficulty articulating in official records. At some point during the second day of inspections, the crews of the human ships began offering meals to the sovereignty inspection officers. Not attempts at bribery, not offers of illicit facilitation, simply food. Thermally insulated containers with items humans called coffee and snack, presented with the kind of distracted courtesy of someone offering a glass of water to a visitor while continuing their conversation. Sub-Lieutenant Karavos had mentioned in the report, almost as a footnote. The human crew proved very hospitable during the process. They offered a hot drink, which I refused due to protocol. They seemed genuinely disappointed. There was something in that observation that kept reverberating in Veth Aros's mind as he reviewed the third day's numbers. By the end of the third day, the fleet's inspection capacity was completely saturated. Every available specialist was allocated. Traffic in the Delta 9 corridor had dropped to 0 for other species, because the human ships, perfectly cooperative and fully within legal norms, had occupied all available maneuvering space and exhausted all bureaucratic capacity of the checkpoints. Veth Aros was on his 11th report to the Admiral when he noticed the pattern that had been before his eyes from the beginning. All manifests were different on the surface, different levels of complexity, different languages, different regulatory references. But there was an underlying consistency. All were technically perfect. Every legal reference was real. Every customs code was correct. Every footnote pointed to a real document that existed in the sovereignty's archives. The humans were not making mistakes. They were not trying to deceive anyone. They were simply using the sovereignty's rules with a precision that the sovereignty itself had never applied to itself. It was like someone who learns a city's traffic regulations more carefully than any local resident, and then drives exactly within all speed limits, stops at every sign for the exact time mandated by law, and signals with the turn signal 15 seconds before each turn as specified in the code, while the surrounding traffic, accustomed to the informal shortcuts that keep a city running, grinds to a complete halt. At 23:00 on the third day, Veth Aros sent a report he had not sent in 30 years of service, an admission of operational incapacity. The Admiral's response arrived 6 minutes later. It was a single line. "Identify the human point of contact responsible for this situation. I want to speak with him." Veth Aros spent the night searching, and found, on the fourth day morning, not a him, but a woman. She was sitting quietly in the cargo area of HC Provisional 7, drinking coffee, with a work screen on her lap, and the serene expression of someone who was exactly where she expected to be. She introduced herself as Logistics Sergeant Elena Vasquez, and when Veth Aros asked her why she was there, she said with a smile he couldn't classify in any category of his diplomatic experience, "We are available to answer any questions about the documentation." There was a thermal coffee container next to her. There was another, untouched, on the opposite side of the table. It had been placed there for Veth Aros. The sub-commander looked at the container, looked at the woman, and for the first time in his career he felt he needed to understand whom he was truly dealing with before taking the next step. He sat down, and, after a moment of hesitation that he mentally registered as a minor lapse in protocol, he accepted the coffee. The coffee was bitter and hot, and smelled of something Veth Aros had not encountered in any olfactory catalog he had consulted. He drank it carefully, expecting some unwanted chemical reaction, and felt nothing but a warmth that descended strangely comforting down his esophagus. He made a mental note to update the substance file. Elena Vasquez watched him drink with the neutral expression of someone awaiting an experiment to complete before drawing conclusions. The cargo area of HC Provisional 7 was functional and unadorned, with stacks of meticulously organized containers along the walls and a clean central space that had been converted, with a folding chair and a field table, into something approaching a campaign office. There was a second screen next to hers, turned off. There was a small device that Veth Aros recognized as a narrow-band privacy field generator, the kind used for sensitive conversations. There was, on the table, a plant in a small pot. A plant. On a cargo ship. Amidst what was shaping up to be one of the most unusual logistical crises in the sovereignty's recent history. Vasquez followed his gaze. "Her name is Margaret. My daughter gave her to me when I boarded. says live plants reduce stress during long missions. She paused. She wasn't wrong. Veth Aros decided it was time to stop making side assessments and get to the point. Sergeant Vasquez, I want to understand what is happening here. I am available to answer any questions about the documentation. The smile hadn't changed. I'm not talking about the documentation. I know. There was a silence that lasted exactly long enough for both to understand they were conversing on a different, non-official level. Who coordinated this? Veth Aros asked. The manifests, the synchronization of ship arrivals, the volume and complexity. This was not improvised. Vasquez placed her own coffee cup on the table with deliberate care. It was not. We took some time preparing. A pause. 17 years, actually. Veth Aros remained motionless. In his species, the absence of movement was the equivalent of an expression of complete shock. Since the preliminary access treaty, she continued, with the tone of someone explaining something that should be obvious, when you let us into the trade corridors, we studied. Every protocol, every regulation, every version of every agreement you've made in the last 200 years, not out of malice, out of necessity. We are a small species in a large space. We needed to understand the rules more deeply than those who wrote them. That explains the knowledge of protocols, Veth Aros said, choosing his words carefully. It doesn't explain the scale. 46 ships, manifests of this complexity. This requires centralized coordination. Vasquez tilted her head slightly. It does. She tapped her work screen, turning it so he could see. It was a connectivity grid, communication lines between distributed points. Are you familiar with the concept of distributed redundancy, Sub-Commander? He was. It was a fundamental logistical principle. Instead of a single vulnerable control point, distribute the system's intelligence among multiple smaller nodes so that the failure of any individual node does not compromise the whole. We don't have an operations headquarters, she said. Never have. Coordination was distributed among civilian and military logistics personnel across 12 systems, using the same commercial communication channels that any freight company uses. There was nothing to intercept that didn't look like normal commercial traffic because it was normal commercial traffic. The difference was what that traffic contained. Veth Aros processed this. An intelligence network disguised as commercial logistics. A commercial logistics network that, under certain circumstances, also functions as response coordination. The infrastructure was the same. The purpose changed according to need. There was something in this description that resonated in a way he needed a moment to identify. It was exactly the kind of solution an efficient logistics department would build to ensure operational resilience. Humans had built their defense capability using the same tools they used to manage commerce. Not because they were particularly bellicose, but because efficiency and survival shared the same architecture. There's more, he said. It wasn't a question. There is, she confirmed. And then, in the same calm voice with which she had described the plant in the pot, she said something that Veth Aros needed to process for several full seconds. Sub-Commander, did you have coffee this morning before coming to speak with me? The question was absurd in its context. No, the machine in Corridor C7 has been broken for 16 days. I know. Maintenance form number 4441B auxiliary has been stalled at level 4 since the 17th day of last month. She said this with perfect naturalness. The company responsible for the maintenance contract for the fleet's auxiliary service equipment is Duran Integrated Services, incorporated in Sector 9 of the Sovereignty. The subcontractor that performs the physical maintenance of beverage and nutrition equipment is Nova Systems Maintenance, with its declared headquarters on Keth Prime. She paused. Veth Aros waited. Nova Systems Maintenance is a wholly owned subsidiary of Omaha Consolidated Logistics, which is a human company, registered in the city of Denver, in the state of Colorado, on the North American continent of planet Earth. She raised her coffee cup again. Your broth is cold because we haven't fixed the machine yet. We could have fixed it on the 12th day, but the form hasn't reached the necessary approval level. We are awaiting the sovereignty's process. The silence that followed lasted longer than any silence Vetharos had experienced in a professional conversation. You are telling me, he said at last, with the careful precision of someone wanting to ensure he understood correctly, that a human company holds the maintenance contract for this fleet's auxiliary equipment. For all 5th and 6th fleets, yes, through a chain of subsidiaries with perfectly local names. We acquired the contracts over the last 11 years, progressively, through competitive proposals that were the lowest in each bidding round because our operational efficiency allows us to offer lower prices. She said this without arrogance, in the same voice with which she would describe the organization of a warehouse. It wasn't initial strategy. It was a natural consequence of being good at what we do. And then we realized what we had built without intending to build. Vetharos placed the coffee cup on the table. He was thinking in terms of logistical vectors, as he had for 30 years. And what he was seeing now was a web of dependencies that extended far beyond the Delta 9 corridor. How much more? He asked. Vasquez tapped her work screen again. A new grid appeared. Connection lines between the sovereignty's infrastructure and origin points marked in light orange. The refined fuel that powers the Unwavering Purpose and 14 other flagships is processed by a refinery on Keth Prime that uses molecular separation technology developed by human engineers and licensed 8 years ago by another subsidiary of Omaha Consolidated. She traced a finger across the screen. The modular 7 Series oxygen recycling systems, which equip 340 of your ships in this sector, were manufactured with components whose supply chain passes through 2 human suppliers. Another line on the grid. The consultancy that updated the inspection manuals for version 12. 3 of the trade protocol, 2 cycles ago, was a branch of Meridian Advisory Group which is based in a city called Singapore. Vetharos was looking at the dependency map and understanding, with the clarity of an equation finally solved, what the message sent 48 hours after the notification of compliance had truly meant. It wasn't a bluff. It had never been a bluff. You spent 17 years, he said, becoming infrastructure. Becoming necessary, she corrected gently. Not as a strategy of domination, as a strategy of survival. A small species in a large space, remember? We couldn't compete in strength, but we could compete in efficiency. And efficiency creates dependency. Not because it's our intention to create dependency, but because when you do something better than anyone else, people come to need you to keep doing it. She stood up, walked to the plant named Margareth, and slightly adjusted the position of the pot so it received more light from the illumination panel above. This is the polite version, Sub-Commander. We are demonstrating what we possess, not what we could do. We haven't reached the second chapter yet. Vetharos became very quiet. What is the second chapter? Vasquez returned to her chair, sat down calmly, and looked at him with an expression he could finally categorize. It was the expression of someone patiently waiting for the other person to arrive at the conclusion that was already before them. It depends, she said, on what the sovereignty decides to do next. Admiral Drethvon had governed the 5th Fleet for 2 cycles with a simple philosophy. The presence of power was power. A fleet of 3,000 ships did not need to demonstrate capability. The capability was self-evident. The act of appearing was, in itself, the message. This philosophy had worked perfectly in 847 previous impositions. Vetharos was sitting in the conference room presenting the report he had spent 6 hours compiling and could observe, with the diagnostic precision of someone who had known the Admiral for 2 cycles, the exact moment when the philosophy began to encounter internal resistance. The report was 83 pages long. Veth Aros had tried to reduce it. He had not succeeded. "Subcommander," the Admiral said when Veth Aros reached the 11th page, "you are telling me that human companies hold maintenance contracts for equipment in this fleet." "Yes, Admiral, through chains of subsidiaries." "Correct. Which were acquired over 11 years through regular bidding processes." "Correct. Every acquisition went through the necessary approvals. The prices were the lowest in each case. Services were rendered within specifications. There was, at no point, a regulatory reason to reject the proposals." The Admiral was silent for a long moment. In Veldur culture, high-duration silence equated to deep processing, not an absence of response. Veth Aros waited. "Logistical dependency can be reversed," the Admiral said at last. "Contracts can be terminated. Alternative suppliers can be identified." "Yes, Admiral. The estimated time frame for complete replacement of human suppliers, especially considering the oxygen recycling systems and the fuel refining chain, is on page 47. Veth Aros paused deliberately. "It's 18 months, an optimistic estimate, assuming all alternative suppliers can scale production within the necessary timeframes." 18 months is acceptable. There's an additional variable, Admiral, page 52. Veth Aros did not need to consult his notes. He had memorized the numbers during compilation. 4 of our flagships in this sector and 18 support ships operate with modular 7 Series oxygen recycling systems. Replacing these systems requires partial disassembly of habitation sections and a maintenance window of 72 days per ship, during which the ship cannot operate under combat conditions. The Admiral processed this. Sequentially, that is manageable. Manageable if the fleets from the 2nd and 4th sectors could cover our area during maintenance windows. The problem is that the analysis on page 58 indicates that the same modular 7 systems are present in significant numbers in the 2nd and 4th sector fleets. The dependency is not specific to this fleet. It is systemic. There were 15 other officers in the room. Veth Aros could perceive, without looking directly, the collective postural adjustment that occurred after that sentence. In species with expressive body language, it would have been described as the kind of movement that happens when a floor that seemed solid produces its first crack. "We can operate without the human systems for 72 hours while we replace them," someone said. It was the tactical operations officer, Keth Irvan, a competent and pragmatic being whom Veth Aros respected. "We can operate without them," Veth Aros confirmed. "But there is a second problem, addressed starting on page 63. He advanced the presentation. "Sergeant Vasquez communicated during our conversation that humans await the Sovereignty's decision on how to proceed. She did not detail what would happen if the Sovereignty opted for a military response to the corridor congestion. I calculated the possibilities." He displayed the dependency map Vasquez had shown him, now reconfigured with data from the entire fleet. The energy management contract for the advanced tactical stations in this sector was renewed 14 months ago by a company called Arcturus Power Solutions, which is a second-tier subsidiary of the same corporate structure as Omaha Consolidated. Veth Aros said this with the absolute neutrality of an officer presenting data. Advanced tactical stations are the primary nodes of our combat communication system and the anchoring points for our perimeter force fields. The energy for these systems is managed remotely, by contract, by Arcturus personnel. The silence this time had a different quality. It was the kind of silence that occurs when the scope of a problem finally filled the entire room. "You are saying," the Admiral began slowly, "that if we order a military response against the human civilian ships in this sector, we would be attacking in an environment where the communication and perimeter defense infrastructure of our tactical positions is managed by personnel linked to the side we are attacking." Veth Aros chose the next sentence with surgical care. "I don't know what would happen. Sergeant Vasquez didn't say what would happen, but I know I have no capacity to guarantee that nothing would happen." There was an expression in standard Galactic for a structural situation where removing a seemingly secondary element resulted in the collapse of the larger system containing it. It was an expression borrowed from architecture, from a historical period when civilizations built physical structures using elements that distributed load in non-obvious ways. The expression was, "load-bearing wall. You only realize which wall supports the ceiling when you try to tear it down." Veth Aros did not use the expression in the formal report, but he was thinking about it. The admiral stood up and walked to the translucent walls displaying the fleet formation. 3,000 pale blue light points, the presence of power as power, the act of appearing as the message. "They know," the admiral said, not as a question, "exactly how much we depend on them." "Yes, Admiral, I believe so. And they chose to show us this way." A pause. "With documentation, with bureaucracy, with coffee." "With the polite version," Veth Aros said, "Sergeant Vasquez's words." The admiral stood before the window for a time Veth Aros did not measure, but which seemed to carry the specific weight of decisions that redefine trajectories. When he returned to the table, there was something different in his posture, not defeat, but the kind of recalibration that occurs when a calculation needs to be redone with variables not present in the original model. What are the options that do not involve immediate conflict? Veth Aros had prepared this section of the report expecting exactly that question. It was page 78. First option, direct negotiation. Withdraw the notification of compliance in exchange for a revised trade agreement, with terms to be defined. Second option, temporary suspension of the imposition, with a deadline for renegotiation. Third option, hierarchical escalation to the High Council of the Sovereignty for policy redefinition regarding the human cluster. "None of these options is a victory," the admiral said. "No, Admiral. But each of them preserves the fleet's operationality and avoids a public admission of dependency." Veth Aros paused. A military response, at this moment, with existing dependencies, could result in a type of damage that would not be contained within this fleet's operational log. It would be known. And what would be known is not that we lost to humans. It's that we didn't realize they were already inside our walls. The admiral looked at him with renewed attention. "You are very direct for a logistics officer, Sub-Commander." "I am a logistics officer, Admiral. My job is to ensure the gears keep turning. Currently, part of the gears belongs to humans. That is a logistical fact." There was a moment where Veth Aros felt the admiral was evaluating something beyond the report, something about the sub-commander himself, about what he had absorbed in those 6 hours with the documents and the dependency map and the conversation with a human sergeant who cultivated a plant named Margareth on a cargo vessel. "You went to the Delta 9 corridor," the admiral said. "You talked to them?" "Yes, Admiral." "What did you think?" Veth Aros considered the question seriously. "I think when they said they wouldn't ask again, it wasn't a threat. It was precisely what it appeared to be." He paused. "It was a description of how things are." The admiral was silent again. Outside the transparent window, 3,000 pale blue light points floated with their unaltered majesty. And within that majesty, invisible in the contracts and manifests and subsidiary networks and oxygen recycling systems, was the infrastructure built by a small species that had decided, 17 years ago, that the best way to survive in a universe of greater powers was to become the wall that the greater powers could not tear down without tearing themselves down. "Summon Sergeant Vasquez," the admiral said at last. "Here, tomorrow at 090. "Yes, Admiral." "And Sub-Commander." The admiral turned to him. "Fix the broth machine in corridor C7, no matter the process." Veth Aros allowed himself, for a single moment, the smallest possible form of something that, in his species, approached an expression of irony. "Yes, Admiral. I believe I can expedite that." Elena Vasquez arrived at the flagship unwavering purpose alone. Veth Aros had expected a delegation. He had prepared the conference room for a delegation. 14 seats, simultaneous translation system calibrated for the most common human dialects, temperature adjusted to the upper limit of human comfort as specified in biological files. When the dock monitoring system reported that the human transport ship had arrived with a single occupant, he had to mentally reorganize the entire structure he had set up for the meeting. Vasquez entered the room, carrying only a personal device and the same thermal coffee container that had been present in her cargo area. She was wearing the same discreet logistics uniform from 2 days ago. She looked at the 14 seats, at the team of 6 sovereignty officers Veth Aros had positioned along the table, at Admiral Dreth Vaughn seated at the head, and then looked at Veth Aros with the expression of someone making a mental note about a discrepancy and filing it for later use. "Sergeant Vasquez," the Admiral said, "I appreciate your presence." "Admiral Dreth Vaughn." She inclined her head slightly. "Sub-Commander Veth Aros." Another nod. Then, with the completely disconcerting naturalness of someone who had arrived for a normal team meeting, she sat in one of the middle chairs at the table, not at the head that had been left open for her, and placed the coffee container before her. "I appreciate the invitation." The Admiral had spent 2 cycles negotiating terms of compliance with representatives of diverse species. Vasquez, Veth Aros observed, had done in 30 seconds something few representatives managed. Chosen where to sit in a way that rearranged the visual balance of the room without saying a single word about it. "I will be direct," the Admiral said. "I prefer that," she confirmed. "The Sovereignty recognizes that the current situation in the Delta 9 corridor has created logistical complications that we had not adequately foreseen." Every word had been chosen with precision by a team of diplomats the previous night. "We also recognize that the structure of auxiliary service provision to our fleet in this sector has a configuration that warrants review." Vasquez listened without a change in expression. "In the name of this mutual understanding, the Sovereignty is willing to explore an adjustment to the terms of the notification of compliance." "I appreciate the openness," Vasquez said, "but I want to confirm I understand correctly. Is the Sovereignty willing to explore an adjustment to the terms or to withdraw the notification?" There was a difference between the 2 options that was, in diplomatic terms, an abyss. Explore an adjustment meant the original terms remained on the table as a starting point for negotiation. Withdraw meant the notification of compliance had simply ceased to exist. The Admiral looked at Veth Aros briefly. It was a look of consultation that Veth Aros had learned to recognize after 2 cycles of joint service. "Withdraw," the Admiral said. "The Sovereignty is willing to withdraw the notification." Vasquez inclined her head again. "That is wise." "In return," the Admiral continued, "we require guarantees regarding the continuity of existing service contracts, and we need to understand the full scope of human presence in our infrastructure." Vasquez opened her personal device. "I can provide both." She slid a file to the central screen of the table. "This is the document we internally call Complete Inventory of Participation. Every contract, every subsidiary, every system where there is any human element in the supply or maintenance chain. We conceal no line." The 6 Sovereignty officers along the table began to scroll through the document. Veth Aros watched their expressions change as they reached different sections. It was like watching someone recognize the extent of a territory they had traversed without realizing they were within its boundaries. "You are offering me total transparency," the Admiral said. "We have always been willing to offer that," Vasquez replied. "The thing is, no one had asked us before. The contracts were acquired openly in regular competitive processes. If anyone had performed a corporate ownership analysis, the links would be discoverable. They were not hidden. They were just not sought." Because no one considered it necessary to examine the suppliers of maintenance services for minor equipment. Exactly. Vasquez brought the coffee container to her lips. We learned early on that larger species tend to underestimate the complexity of systems that seem small. A broken broth machine is not a threat. A maintenance contract for oxygen recycling systems is just a service contract. No single item individually seemed important enough for strategic attention. A pause. The sum of the items had a different nature. The tactical operations officer, Keth Irvan, had reached the section of the document referring to advanced tactical stations. Sergeant, the energy management contracts you hold. Should the sovereignty terminate these contracts, what are the transition procedures? It was a technical question, technically phrased, but there was a secondary layer that everyone in the room understood. It was also a question about what would happen if the sovereignty decided to try to operate without humans. The technical transition can be done in 90 days with full support from our team, Vasquez said. We offer this openly. None of our contracts have forced exclusivity clauses. The sovereignty can terminate whenever it wishes and will receive full transition support. That has always been our policy. So, Keth Irvan said, with the precision of someone checking an equation, you have no interest in creating forced dependency. Never have, Vasquez confirmed. Forced dependency creates resentment, and resentment creates conflict, and conflict creates cost. We prefer chosen dependency. The sovereignty uses our services because they are the best available at a competitive price. If another supplier offers equivalent quality at an equivalent price, the sovereignty can choose that supplier. We would not object. But so far, no other supplier has offered that. No, because we are very good at what we do. It was a factual statement, delivered without arrogance, with the same tone with which one would describe a technical specification. Veth Aros had been silent for much of the meeting, as was his role as a logistics officer in diplomatic contexts. But there was a question that had been forming since the conversation in the cargo area 2 days prior, and he realized this was the moment to ask it. Sergeant Vasquez, she turned to him. You mentioned this was the polite version, that there would be a second chapter if the sovereignty chose a different response. He paused. Can you tell us what that chapter would contain? Vasquez considered the question for a moment that seemed deliberate, not evasive. I can describe the general philosophy without operational details. She placed the coffee container back on the table. Humanity does not have the capacity to win a conventional military conflict with the sovereignty. That was never part of our calculation. The second chapter would not be a war. It would be a demonstration. Of what? That removing humans from an infrastructure that has become dependent on them creates systemic costs greater than the alternative. Not through sabotage, not through destruction, through absence. She paused. When you remove a load-bearing wall from a building, the building doesn't explode. It simply begins to give way, slowly, at points that sometimes have no obvious relation to the removed wall. The process is diffuse, gradual, and very expensive to reverse once started. The silence that followed had the quality of a calculation being completed by multiple processors simultaneously. But that chapter doesn't need to be written, Vasquez said, with a voice that had subtly changed in tone, no longer purely technical, now with something Veth Aros identified as the specific weight of genuine preference. I deeply prefer not to have to write it. I have colleagues whose children will grow up in this galactic space. I have a daughter who gave me a plant for the ship because she wants me to reduce stress. A pause. We want trade. We want interaction. We want access to the universe without needing to ask the sovereignty for permission to exist in it. That is all the 48-hour message meant. Admiral Drethvon remained motionless for a long moment. Then, with the kind of movement that ends a processing phase and initiates an action phase, he opened his own device and made a formal record. The sovereignty withdraws notification of compliance SV7, 4 Human 001 with immediate effect. The human cluster will retain its rights of autonomous navigation in the trade corridors according to the original agreements of the Preliminary Access Treaty. Negotiations for an expanded trade agreement will commence next cycle. Vasquez inclined her head one last time. We appreciate it. There is one condition, the Admiral said. She waited. We want to know what else is a load-bearing wall. Vasquez looked at him for a moment. Then, for the first time since she had entered the room, she smiled with something beyond professional courtesy, with something Vetharos recognized, upon revisiting the moment later in his records, as genuine satisfaction. That, she said, is the right question to start with. The human ships disappeared from the Delta 9 corridor within 48 hours. Not dramatically, not in a calculated exit formation designed to impress. They simply departed, one by one, over 2 days, with the same discrete normalcy with which they had arrived, each following its usual trade route, as if the interlude of the past 6 days had been a minor deviation in the regular schedule. Traffic from other species, held back while the corridor was congested, resumed its normal flow. Inspection queues dissolved. The sector returned to its everyday operational appearance in less time than Vetharos had predicted. On the eve of the last human ship's departure, a message arrived at Vetharos's personal communications terminal. Not to the official fleet channel, not to the diplomatic correspondence system. To his personal terminal, whose address was not in any public access record of the sovereignty. It was from Sergeant Elena Vasquez. The message contained 3 items. The first was a short note. Sub-Commander, it was an honor. For the record, the machine in Corridor C7 was repaired this morning. Maintenance form 4441B auxiliary closed. The broth should be hot now. The second item was a 6-page document titled Executive Summary of Structural Dependencies, Sector 9, Preliminary Compilation, with a note explaining that the full list had been transmitted to the official diplomatic channel for use in next cycle's negotiations. The third item was what Vetharos stared at for longer than he had stared at any document in the last 10 years. It was a recipe. Chamomile tea with honey, to reduce cortisol in moments of professional stress. Easy to prepare in any environment with a heat source. Ingredients are available through the Meridian distributor on Keth Prime, a third-tier subsidiary, should you wish to verify the chain of origin. And then, on a separate line, in the same voice that had described load-bearing walls and philosophies of survival and the name of a plant in a pot. I hope the universe is easier to navigate from now on. Vetharos read the recipe 3 times. Then he filed it in a folder he had created specifically for documents that did not fit into any existing category of his organization system. The folder had a single file before this message, a copy of the Notification of Compliance SV7, 4 Human 001, withdrawn, with the withdrawal date. He went to Corridor C7. The vending machine was working. The nutrient broth came out hot, at the exact temperature specified in the standard settings, for the first time in 16 days. Vetharos drank the broth standing in the corridor, without returning to his workstation, which was a minor violation of professional posture protocol he would not normally commit. He stood there for a reasonable time, drinking the hot broth and thinking. What he thought took the specific form of an equation that had changed its nature midway through the resolution process. He had started with a simple equation: power versus power, capability versus capability, notification of compliance, and predictable response. The resulting equation was completely different. It wasn't about power versus power. It was about time versus time, patience versus haste, depth of knowledge versus superficiality of analysis. Humans had won because they had studied more, not because they were stronger, not because they had superior technology, not because they had strategic allies or hidden armaments. They had won because, when they signed the Preliminary Access Treaty 17 years ago, they had decided that any treaty is a window, and that windows reveal the interior of a house to those who have the patience to observe, and that sufficiently prolonged and attentive observation reveals where the load-bearing walls are. Vetharos wrote the final logs of Operation Delta 9 that afternoon, sitting at his workstation with the hot broth beside him. It was the 12th report in a sequence that would become one of the most studied documents in the sovereignty's strategic analysis programs, though he did not know it yet. He wrote with his usual precision, with the technical language and categorical care that had defined his career. But in the penultimate paragraph, he wrote something he had not written in any previous report. Personal analysis note: the sovereignty operated on the assumption that projected power is real power. This operation demonstrated that real power is the ability to disrupt an adversary's system without firing a shot. Humans acquired this ability not through confrontation, but through utility. They became necessary. Necessity cannot be eliminated by decree or by force without a cost equivalent to or greater than the cost of simply acknowledging that necessity. I recommend that the sovereignty's strategic analysis revise threat assessment criteria to include not only military capability, but infrastructure capability. A species that maintains your oxygen recycling systems is harder to remove than a species with more ships. End of note. He reviewed the paragraph, considered removing it for being excessively personal for an operational report, and decided to keep it. Negotiations for the Human Cluster Expanded Trade Agreement began the next cycle, as promised. Vetharos did not participate directly, but was consulted on 6 distinct occasions by the diplomatic team, who had discovered that his experience with human logistics made him the most useful officer available for contextual questions. In the months that followed, he read extensively about humanity. Not the 12-page intelligence briefs, but the broader archives, the historical compilations, the records of how that species had survived its own internal conflicts, the extreme variability of its planet, the brevity of its life expectancy in the galactic context. What he found did not surprise him as much as it would have before the conversation in the cargo area with a logistics sergeant and a plant named Margareth. Humans were compulsive storytellers. Every civilization recorded history, but humanity recorded with a density and diversity that sovereignty analysts had categorized as excessive cultural noise. Vetharos began to read this noise and understood that it was not noise. It was the documentation of how a species learns from every possible mistake, and then tells the story of the mistake to ensure others do not need to make it. They were a species that had lived on a planet that killed them frequently and regularly, and had developed, in response to this, an ability to recognize patterns in complex systems, to anticipate failures before they occurred, to build redundancies where others built simplicity. This ability, transplanted into the galactic context, had produced a network of maintenance contracts that were, in reality, a complete cartography of the vulnerabilities of a civilization that had existed for 3 centuries without ever examining its own points of dependency. Humanity had found the sovereignty's load-bearing walls because the sovereignty had never needed to find them. On the last day of the cycle, Vetharos received a communication from the new human trade attaché for Sector 9, a diplomat named Dr. Amara Ose, who had been appointed as part of the expanded agreement structure. It was a formal introductory message, conventional in its structure, but which ended with a line that Vetharos reread with the same attention he had given to the phrase, "We will not ask again." Sub-Commander Vetharos. Sergeant Vasquez asked me to convey her regards and mention that Maintenance Form 4441B Auxiliary has been closed with an excellent service rating. We hope the broth is hot. Vetharos looked at the vending machine in Corridor C7 through his office's open door. The broth was hot. It had been hot since the morning Vasquez's message had arrived. He wrote a brief reply to Dr. Ose, confirming receipt and expressing readiness for efficient collaboration. Then he sat at his workstation for a long moment, looking at the sector route map on the main screen. The light points representing ships of dozens of species moving through the corridors that traverse the space between stars. Somewhere in that movement, there were 12 systems inhabited by beings who had decided, decades ago, that the best defense available to a small species in a large universe was indispensability, that the most solid form of security was not having more ships, but being the reason why others' ships kept flying. That patience, applied with sufficient consistency and intelligence, was a form of power that did not appear in any armaments inventory, but which, when necessary, was harder to circumvent than any force field. The universe had changed that week, not dramatically, not with battles and epic declarations, with impossible cargo manifests, with a vending machine repaired at 0600 on any given morning, and with a chamomile tea recipe that arrived at a personal terminal whose address was not in any public record. Vetharos filed the map, drank the last sip of hot broth, opened the next report in the queue. It was the inventory of maintenance contracts for the entire Third Fleet. He read it with an attention he had not dedicated to contract inventories in 30 years of his career, and found, on the 17th page, the name of a company called Pacific Rim Maintenance Solutions, headquartered in a human city called Sydney, responsible for the air recycling systems of logistical support ships. Vetharos made a note, added the name to the file he had created for uncategorized documents. Then, for a reason he would not have been able to articulate precisely in technical language, but which he recognized as the kind of understanding that changes how one views an entire system, he smiled slightly. They were load-bearing walls. Everywhere. And the humans knew them all. End of story. If humanity's silent tenacity and ingenuity inspired you, subscribe to the channel for more chronicles from the galactic frontier, where every species has its power, but only one learned that becoming necessary is the victory no fleet can conquer in reverse.